Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation of Rochester's Rich History on the architecture of James H. Johnson. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division at the Rochester Public Library. James H. Johnson was a visionary architect, probably the most brilliant architect of the 20th century in Rochester. He's best known for his work on the Mushroom House and on several area churches, including the St. John the Evangelist in Greece. Due to the recent loss of a James H. Johnson building in Greece, the Greece Historical Society commissioned our presenters today, Chris Brandt and Katie Eggers-Comeau, to carry out a survey over the past year and a half of Johnson's work. Today's presentation is designed to coincide with the release of the Rochester History Journal article on Johnson's work. Christopher Brandt is an architect at Barrow Architecture, a firm with a legacy of over 40 years of historic preservation practice. He was born and raised in the Rochester region and has been active in its historic preservation community since high school. Chris received a BS in architecture from the University of Buffalo and a master's in architecture with a certificate in historic preservation from the University of Virginia. Outside of his day job restoring and adapting old buildings, he serves as the advocacy and education coordinator of the Young Urban Preservationists, obsessive-compulsively researches local history, and is DIY restoring the small historic home he shares with his wife. Katie Eggers-Comeau is the architectural historian at Barrow Architecture. She assists clients throughout Western New York with historic resource surveys, National Register nominations, and tax credit applications. A native of the Rochester area, she has a BA in Humanities from Yale and an MS in Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. After working for a few years at a preservation consulting firm in Washington, D.C., she moved back to Rochester to take a job at the Landmark Society of Western New York. She recently completed her service as a trustee of the National Association for Olmsted Parks and frequently gives presentations on Rochester's historic park system. Without further ado, Katie Eggers-Comeau and Chris Brandt.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Katie, obviously, and thank you for coming to this or attending in whatever fashion from wherever you are. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you to the Rochester Public Library for hosting us for this presentation today. And as Brandon said, we did start out this project because of the loss of a Johnson building, which you'll see in a couple of minutes. And Gina DeBella, who I know is with us today, really spearheaded this whole thing and helped us out as well. So in addition to the Greece Historical Society, I do want to thank Gina for her help with this project. So we had the wonderful opportunity, which is really rare, that we were able to spend months going through James Johnson's slides, his drawings, his materials, talking to friends and family and co-workers of his. And it's a rare opportunity to have that chance to get to kind of be the first ones in on the work of such an interesting and visionary architect, while all his papers and everything were still mostly all in one place. That was really an unusual and wonderful thing to be able to do. So we are going to kind of go through his career from start to finish, focusing especially on a particularly creative and interesting period in the 1960s. But we're hoping to give you kind of a sense of the whole span of what he did, because it goes way beyond the few buildings and projects that a lot of people are familiar with. So here he is in front of his most famous house, obviously the Mushroom House, which we will get to. And let's see, so I'm going to start out by talking about kind of the early part of his career. And if you can go ahead one more, Chris. Here he is as a young man. He was born in 1932 in Springfield, Missouri. His family included a number of developers and contractors who were very active in that area. And as a result, he became very interested in construction and building. And he was particularly interested in hands-on construction. He had the opportunity to work on construction sites with his uncles during his summer vacations. One of them owned a concrete plant. And so he got interested in concrete, which, as we'll see, was an important theme in his career. His other uncle was a contractor and an architect, and advised him that it would be a good idea to study architecture because it would give him a lot of options in his career. He took his uncle's advice and went to Drury College briefly, and then to Oklahoma A&M. And he talked about his career in school as always having been a little bit of an outsider. He always saw things differently from his peers. He talked about how they would get an assignment to design a bank or a zoo or whatever it would be, and everybody else's drawings would look kind of the same, and his would always be different because he just wanted to do things the way he saw them and what he wanted, and not necessarily what was fashionable or stylish at the time. So here's a drawing that he did while he was a student for a skyscraper tower. It actually looks very strongly like Frank Lloyd Wright's Price Tower in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So he was certainly looking at the work of Frank Lloyd Wright as an inspiration at that time. He had the opportunity that was quite unusual to have one of his student design projects actually built. This is the Pace Setter House in Springfield. And it was meant to be sort of a prototype for a modern house. And because of his uncles in the construction business, one of them was able to have it built as a showcase. And it has a strong modernist architectural character, international style is what we would call that, with very sleek and simple materials, concrete just used as exposed concrete, flat roof, very strong intersecting horizontal and vertical planes. All of that's very kind of cutting edge for that time period in the 1950s. When he graduated in 1956, he worked briefly with an architect locally named Abe Lane Immel, who was a student of Bruce Goff, who in turn had been a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. And while he was working there, he did get to meet Bruce Goff, who was a very well-known and kind of idiosyncratic architect of the time, and Bruce Goff was particularly well known for his approach to organic architecture, which he described as kind of using materials in a very natural way, using interesting geometries and shapes drawn from nature, and having a very individualistic approach. And we'll see that that had a very strong influence on Johnson throughout his career. Probably the most important thing that happened around this time was that in the spring of 1956, he married Sarah, and the two of them went to D.C. for a brief amount of time because he had a commitment through ROTC there. So they had to finish up a little bit of time there. But after that, he had told Sarah that they could go wherever she wanted, and where she wanted to come was Rochester, because she is a professional musician now. At the time, she had a scholarship to study at Eastman. So we have Sarah to thank for the Johnsons moving here. When he got here, he got a job at Bohackett and Flynn, which is a firm in downtown Rochester. He made some very important friendships and professional colleagues that he met there were important to him throughout his life. And one of the projects he worked on there also was very influential for his career. He worked on a school for Our Lady of Mercy Parish in Greece, and the school is the one in the lower right here. And that was a very typical kind of 1950s curtain wall international style school, but he got to supervise that project. A few years later, the priest from that parish, Father Whalen, wanted to have Johnson work for him again to work on the parish hall. By then, Johnson had moved on to a different architectural firm, and neither Bohackett and Flynn nor the new firm really wanted to pursue this project, but Johnson himself did, and Father Whalen wanted Johnson. So that was the point at which Jim Johnson formed his own solo practice and went off and worked for himself, which he did for the rest of his career. And that was really important to him because he wanted to do his own thing. He liked that better than working for other people. So the parish hall he designed was in the photograph on the lower left. The photo on the top shows the three buildings that he ultimately did for this campus, and we'll get to the third one soon, but the kind of middle background is the parish hall, and on the right is the school in that photograph. So what's particularly interesting with this parish hall is what he did with the interior of the building. The idea behind this design was that this was a quickly growing campus that wanted to build a temporary sanctuary space that they would later be able to convert into a kind of all-purpose meeting and recreational area. So they built this while they were kind of waiting to have the money to build the full sanctuary space. What's really notable here is that this was the first time that Johnson collaborated very closely with artists, and the specific artists he worked with were people who he worked with repeatedly in his career, the ceramic artists Kurt Feuerherm and the brothers James and Philip Sechrist. They created this modern altar screen that hangs down, kind of filtering the light from that large window that's behind the altar. And this theme of collaboration with artists in general and with these artists in particular was important throughout his career. He integrated the arts into his work in a way that was quite unusual. So he did early in his career quite a bit of residential work. He designed a number of tract houses for suburban residential buildings, many of which I imagine many of you have seen and wouldn't even know it because they were kind of typical looking in a lot of ways. Sometimes there's a little clue that it's not just the ordinary tract house, but a lot of times they are sort of not very eye-catching. We called those his bread and butter projects, or he called them his bread and butter projects. We called them his four daughters project because he was the dad of four daughters and obviously needed to keep the workflow steady. So you can't always pick and choose the most exciting projects. Sometimes you just got to do what comes through the door. And I think he did also really like doing residential work. But he designed a couple of really interesting houses at this stage that we're going to show you. This one is his own private home for himself and his family in the town of Penfield. And you can see here a very strong Japanese influence with the strong horizontal lines and the rich woodwork, and also that sense of the melding of the interior and exterior, which we're going to see in a number of his different projects. The photograph on the right, which was from a newspaper photo, so the quality of this particular image is not the best, but you can see that there was this interior kind of courtyard or garden space, and that's one of the daughters sitting there. And then the rooms were arranged around the outside. Now on the left, you see the floor plan, which only looks kind of wavy like that because the drawing had been rolled up and we flattened it out. It is definitely a square or a rectangle. So you can see there that in the center is, or just a little above center, but the central room there is that garden atrium space. And then the rooms and the garage go around the outside. There was an office space for Jim and his helpers, who he had kind of off and on, that had its own separate entrance and the ability to overlook the garden space so that when Sarah was out working on her musical career, he could keep an eye on the girls. And then Sarah's got her own music room there over on the left with the piano, and then the bedrooms and the kitchen and so on arranged around the outside. This house is still standing. It's easy to find if you know what you're looking for, but unfortunately it has been changed quite a bit. The other house, this was one of our favorite finds in this project, which was a house he did also quite early in his career after he established his own practice, and it's in the town of Chilai. It's for another couple who happened to be living in the same apartment complex as the Johnsons before they built their Penfield house, so we think they probably knew each other. And maybe wanted a house that was a little bit similar. It has a similar low-pitched hipped roof line, similar boxy character, and it even has a garden feature on the inside. It's not as central to the design as in the Johnson's house, but underneath the stairs there where you see those two tall vases, that was originally a garden space. And then it has a little wall out, or niches there where they had hanging plants that all were kind of coordinated together. Some owners before the previous owners took that garden space out. I don't know if it ever was particularly successful in that location under the stairs. But other than that, the house, we think, is in pretty pristine condition. The owners who live there now do a wonderful job taking care of it, and are very proud of the house. And we were really happy that we got to see this particular one. So right in the mid-1960s, Johnson's career took a very big leap when he had a couple of very visible projects that gained a lot of publicity. The first was St. John the Evangelist Church, which is in the town of Greece. This was another very quickly growing congregation that needed a bigger space because they had outgrown their small church, which is still standing, but was too small as the town of Greece was just growing very quickly in population, and this congregation was getting much larger. So this represents a distinct change from what we've seen with these very boxy kind of international style projects with the strict squares and flat roofs and things. He was exploring much more complicated geometry and a more sculptural approach with this rather striking looking building. And if we can go on, there we go. So he really enjoyed experimenting with just how far he could go with kind of what I've heard people call structural gymnastics. So doing things that visually look like they should not work, structurally, but he always found a way to make them work. And the way he did that was he had a brilliant structural engineer named Ray Pasquale who was working with him. And so if Jim Johnson wanted to have some very daring effect visually that didn't seem like it should be possible structurally, they would figure out a way to make it happen. So what's happening with this particular building is you have this concrete cylinder, which you would think would be the kind of the structural support for the whole structure. So those long roof beams should be going right into that and be supported by the concrete cylinder. But as you can see, it's actually cut away beneath where the beams come in. And so that is something that visually looks a little bit unsettling because it looks like those beams are not supported because of the big void beneath them. But somehow they figured out how to make that happen and to make that very striking visual effect happen. Something that he did in this and a number of other projects is called a warped roof, which is where you have these straight structural members that each one is straight, but put together they look like a curve, and we're going to see that again in many different projects, and I think Chris can explain that a little bit more when we get to his part of the presentation. So here you can see on the interior how that looks, where you have those beams that are going up and then this huge void of where the cylinder of light comes down into the congregation. It's very, very striking. He did work again with artists on this particular project. The Sechrist brothers designed the original light fixtures, which are not the ones that you see here. He worked with the metal artist Carl Zolo on the Stations of the Cross, and also what's not pictured here are the baptistry doors. And then Wendell Castle, our famous local furniture designer, did a lot of the furniture, including the 3 chairs that you see there and 2 of the 3 kneelers, not the third one, but the ones that all look like they're kind of coordinated. Those are all by Wendell Castle. The altar screen was another collaboration between Kurt Freierherm and the Sechrist brothers. And then what's particularly interesting and is kind of the precursor to what we're going to see again and again was Johnson's first foray into earth cast concrete. This was a technique that had been done on a smaller scale with sculpture going back centuries, but was somewhat experimental in terms of architecture of anything like this scale. So what happens here is you had the ceramic pieces that are those decorative pieces, the lion and the other Christian iconography, were created first and set into these molds, and then the concrete gets poured over that, and then that's all left to cure and dry, and when it's done, the pieces are tipped up to become the exterior walls of the structure with the artwork really integrated very closely into that. So it all becomes one thing, the art and the architecture, in a way that's different from a typical building where the artwork gets kind of hung on the building. Here, as in maybe like a Gothic church where you have the sculpture that's part of the architecture, you see a new way of integrating art and architecture in a very cohesive way. This building got a lot of attention. Johnson was chosen as the winner of the Lillian Fairchild Award, which is given through the University of Rochester for an outstanding work of art by a Rochester resident. And that doesn't very often go to architects, but now and then it does, and in this case it did. So just as that building was nearing completion in the summer of 1964, Rochester launched its first ever design competition, and this was for the redesign of a small triangle in the middle of downtown that had buildings on it. It's hard to imagine it now if you know the Liberty Pole Triangle, but that little area had all these old, kind of dilapidated buildings, and became the smallest urban renewal project in the country. And as I said, it was the first ever design competition for Rochester. The criteria they established included that the project had to be designed to fit the space and particularly to be appealing from a distance. They kind of didn't want people necessarily crossing traffic, since it had traffic on all 3 sides at the time, to go up and have to look really closely to appreciate it. They wanted people to be able to appreciate it from afar. And it needed to look good all year round. That was another key consideration given our changes of seasons and things here. So they had a 5-member jury for this project, 4 of whom were out of town, or from out of town, and received 123 anonymous entries. Johnson described how he stayed up all night. He'd been thinking and thinking and thinking about this all summer, and then the night before it was due, he stayed up all night and had this flash of inspiration for what he wanted to do, and drew what became the Liberty Pole, which was inspired by the history of the site. So here, and in the next, yep, there we go, we see the what that warped roof technique looks like. This obviously is not a roof, but again, all these cables, which were all very carefully, they used an early computer to figure out exactly how to make all these cables work because they are supporting the structure. But each one of those is flat, or is straight. But you can see how when you put them all together, you get this curving effect, kind of like a billowing sail. The idea of lighting it up was not Johnson's idea, and I think he did not like it. He didn't want it to look like a Christmas tree, but nevertheless, as we know, that's a kind of a cherished tradition here that we do light this up every year. This is an addition Johnson built to a shopping plaza. You can see the existing shopping plaza on the left, which is in Webster. It was a very ordinary looking 1950s or 60s shopping plaza that wanted to add one more store. So they hired him to do it, and I can't help wondering if they were a little bit surprised that rather than sort of continue what the rest of it looked like, he came up with this wonderful little space-age Jetsons looking building with this butterfly roof, I guess. I think we called it a double butterfly roof. There's probably a better word for that, but with this extraordinary roof line and these tall, narrow windows, it's a really striking little building. We were so excited when we'd seen this address and went out to look at it and went, oh, yep, that would be the one. And I think it was originally a liquor store. Maybe now it's a hair salon. They've done a very nice job keeping the interior so that you still see those interesting corner clerestory windows and the long strips of light. It's just kind of an example of how even when he had a sort of prosaic assignment, he managed to do something really interesting a lot of times with what he was given to do. So here are a couple of other interesting projects that he did throughout our region. In the upper left is actually an example of a tract house that he did that if you saw the house, you maybe wouldn't give it a second thought, but there are some kind of interesting details in the way he's arranged kind of the windows and the roof lines, and I think there's a very broad chimney there. That's a thing that Frank Lloyd Wright especially liked to do. You can just kind of see its low kind of sticking up above the roof there. He did a motel in the lower left, I think. Oh yes, that's out in Parrington. So again, kind of an ordinary assignment, but very typical of its era with the exposed materials and just a little bit of a modern look. On the upper right is another one of these temporary chapels that he did for a growing congregation that needed a temporary space and integrated this interesting kind of metallic sculptural artwork behind it. And then lower right is another kind of interesting modern house that he did. So he had a lot of interesting kind of smaller scale projects that nevertheless he managed to find ways to make them creative and unusual. So one of the things we had to do with this project that I won't get into a lot of the details, but was kind of come up with categories for different types of work that he did. And so we were very interested in this particular phase of his career when he was exploring organic architecture. And organic can mean a number of different things. Sometimes it means looks like it grew from the earth, and he did certainly do some buildings like that. Sometimes it has to do more with geometry and using math and interesting kind of number ways of coming up with interesting buildings. In this particular phase of his career, he was taking that earth-formed technique that we saw at St. John the Evangelist Church and just pushing it about as far as anybody possibly could, and maybe sometimes even a little too far, as we'll see. So this was the first in an amazing series of projects that he did. This is Our Lady of Mercy Rectory. So this is going back to that campus where he had already done the school and the parish hall. Father Whalen came back and wanted him to design a rectory, and he wanted it to be along the same lines as the Johnson house, with the exterior rooms around the perimeter and then an interior garden or atrium space. They both agreed that this was the perfect model for a rectory because you wanted to have a space of privacy and retreat for the priests, but also some place where they could have kind of a shared life to some extent. A place that was quiet and contemplative, but also a little bit communal. So this is how they did the earth casting project here, and they kind of took that idea from St. John the Evangelist and went a little bit farther with it. So they designed these molds right in the earth. This is right on construction site and this was primarily the Sechrist brothers figuring out how this would all be done. So they created these molds, created the texture that they wanted with that interesting ridged surface, poured the concrete right there on the site. When it cured, lifted up the panels, and those formed the exterior walls again. And then we have the interior with that beautiful courtyard space in the atrium. So in the lower right, you see the finished campus with the 3 buildings that Johnson designed. So the school on the right, the parish hall at the back, in the background in the center, and then the front left, this is the rectory. So this is the 3rd building that completed that group of really critical buildings from 3 stages of his career. The first project that he did when he was still at the firm, his first solo project, and then this first example of really taking this earth cast concrete and making it the kind of entire exterior of the building. Unfortunately, this campus changed use a few years ago, and none of this is really recognizable today. The school and the parish hall have been changed to the point that you would not really be able to recognize them, particularly the parish hall. And unfortunately, the rectory was demolished. So this is the building that kicked off this whole project. So as often happens, a loss hopefully kind of galvanizes people to realize that they don't want to lose anymore. And so it was important to Greece Historical Society that we catalog what was still out there so that this type of loss wouldn't sneak up on anybody again. This is the next in this interesting series of earth cast concrete buildings. It's St. Januarius. My kids call this the Pineapple Church whenever we go by there, but it wasn't inspired by the pineapple. It was actually inspired by the grape. It takes a little imagination to picture this, but the kind of profile of it, if you looked from above, the footprint of the roof line, the roof shape looked from above, is somewhat like a grape leaf. And then it was also inspired by the topography of Naples with the mountains. And there are previous churches on the right, and you can also see that previous church in the background behind the building because it did still stand when they built the new church. And I always think about what it must have been like for these congregations, used to being in a very traditional looking building, to suddenly have something like this that is so unusual. So the process here was pretty similar to what they did for the rectory that we just saw. They did cast these panels in the earth on the site. They laid the glass in, and what you'll notice is how different the texture is of those concrete walls on the exterior, where it looks like these kind of small little pierced, relatively small pierced openings for the windows, versus the interior, which has this strong honeycomb texture with these deep recesses that allow the light to just kind of radiate in and expand and fill that whole space in a very interesting way. So again, they built the panels, tipped them up, arranged them around the exterior, and built the roof on top of that. And what's so interesting is the way the walls almost seem to disappear, they just glow, and Chris talks about this being similar to the effect of a Gothic cathedral when the intention of the designer is to make the wall disappear and just become a wall of light, which is a technically difficult thing to do, but there have been different ways found to do it, and this honeycomb texture made that kind of happen with this building. We talked to Peter Romeo, who was working with Jim Johnson at the time, and he talked about how surprising it was. We asked if anything had surprised him about any of the projects they worked on. He said this one was the biggest surprise because he hadn't really envisioned what that light effect would look like, and the fact that as the sun moves around the building through the day, you get changing light that just reflects off everything, reflects off the people, and it's this very living kind of environment in the interior. So the next in the series is Temple Sinai, which is in the town of Brighton. It is actually a designated town landmark, so it's one of the few Johnson buildings that does have some protection. And the building that we're talking about, the entry pavilion on the right with that swooping upward roof, was a later addition, we think a very sensitive later addition, but that was not part of the original building. The original building is the sanctuary space, which is the tent-like space that you see a little bit to the left, and then wrapping around it you can just barely see, and you'll see it in some of the other photographs to the left. In the background is the wood exterior of the education and kind of social wing that wraps around the outside. So at this point I am going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about how this building was constructed.
Okay, so as Katie mentioned before, as far as the overall configuration of the building, it's certainly a little more clear here on the drawings here on the left of the screen, where you can see that sort of low 1 and 1.5 story sort of surrounding U-shaped wing that creates a courtyard of sorts that the temple space exists within. And then on the right, you can begin to see in the sort of photograph from the Democratic Chronicle the methods by which they constructed the sanctuary space. And at the end of the presentation, we're hoping we'll have enough time. We'll show you a short video that actually shows the pieces being craned into place. Jim Johnson, thankfully, was pretty fastidious about documenting a lot of his projects during this key period in his career, and documented a number of them with video. But essentially, the temple itself is this strongly metaphorical piece of architecture that the desire to have a tent is directly correlated to the nomadic history of the Jewish people, and the tent form is constructed of 10 panels representative of the 10 tribes of Israel. And these panels, each one similar to what we saw in St. Januarius, as well as with Our Lady of Mercy Rectory, panels are cast in the earth, but now they're really starting to get considerable in their scale as far as how large these castings are. But it's similar method to where the molds are dug by hand into the earth and formed and sculpted in the concrete, and reinforcing placed within those and cast, and then they're craned into place. But because of the scale of these particular panels, they are craned with using 2 cranes, one controlling the bottom, one controlling the top, so that they can sort of tip them up and control them to keep them from collapsing. And then you can see in this photograph a sort of rather small scale steel bar or beam is placed between the 2 panels at the very top that essentially is only doing the work of holding the panels apart, and most of the vertical load is transferred down through the panels to the foundation below. And those little steel beams are incorporated into the skylight, which we see here. And so they pretty much disappear because they appear as though they're just mullions that are holding glass. But if you sort of look here where there's these down lights that are arranged on a standard mullion, and then we see a thicker mullion here, which you can sort of see as 2 parts if you squint hard enough. And that bottom part that's deeper, that's that structural piece of steel that's holding the panels apart. But it creates this sort of amazingly enthralling space of the sort of glass wrapping up and around you. And then the platform within the temple that the seating and altar is on, the platform does not touch the walls, so that you're sort of floating within this larger tent-like space with ivy climbing up the walls. And this is the movie clip, but we'll show you that later. And then directly after this was Penfield Presbyterian Church. And this is sort of, as Katie maybe forewarned a little bit, Johnson sort of pushing it to the absolute limit. And this project, as well as a private home that we'll talk about, these are a little different in method of construction, in that instead of a panelized system, this earth form project and then the house that we'll show are essentially large single castings, where a sort of large earthwork is made and sculpted using heavy equipment, and then concrete is poured on top of that with this sort of steel reinforcing. You essentially pour the entire building all at once, and then dig the earth back out after you're done, and the concrete is cured. And so Penfield Presbyterian is sort of the most ostentatious attempt at doing this, with the desired form to essentially be an upturned lily flower, which we see here in the sketch. And then a little more clearly here in this photo of a model to the left. But the project was never fully constructed as designed due to budget constraints. We can see here on the right, this is one of the few photos from the pier that we were able to find that shows the sort of completed work. It was oddly enough used as an advertisement for furniture locally, but you can see these sort of petal forms but the petals never do that sort of final thrust upward to create the throat of the flower. And the original design, as shown in the model, Johnson's intent was to have the sanctuary, the sort of center of all the activity for the parish, be within the throat of the flower and have this amazing sort of skylit space, some 80 or 90 feet tall. And then surrounding that, each petal comprised a different function of the parish, from their offices and administrative section, Sunday school, a kindergarten, et cetera. So each petal would sort of be used as that. But as built, one of the petals sort of served as a temporary chapel. And then due to sort of an early onset of roof leaks and other problems, the building actually had a whole separate superstructure built over top of it, which you see in the more contemporary photo. So there's a whole new building essentially built up and around the original sort of flower. Although sort of Jim, in his modesty and as well as having a good sense of humor, quipped about this building that he thought it was a unique honor of his, that he thought he might be the only architect in the world that could say that he had an entombed building, because he was not sort of involved with a project that sort of covered the whole thing up. But when you enter underneath, you can still see this sort of the rough sort of undersides of the sort of concrete petals of the original flower design. And then this sort of rounded wall here in the bottom left photograph, that's at the sort of center of the flower that would have been that sort of 80 to 90 foot tall sanctuary space. The airplane house here, it's in the town of Victor. This is the other sort of earthwork casting project. So instead of being the sort of panelized or sort of unitized buildings that we saw in a lot of the previous earth form designs, the airplane house, as well as Penfield Presbyterian, these are sort of monolithic concrete pours that are poured on top of sculpted earth, and the earth is dug out from underneath after the fact. A benefit of that method of construction in particular for this house is that the original owners noted that when they bought the land, it was essentially relatively perfectly flat farmland, but due to the need to sort of pile up this earth to create the earthwork to cast house, it allowed them to play with the topography of the land, creating a sort of more dramatic setting for this sort of dramatic house. You can see here, there's a historic photo there on the left, sort of from the front, where you have this sort of sheltering cave-like entrance that leads you to the main doors. You can see there on the more contemporary photo on the right. This house in particular is sort of exceedingly rare than Johnson's body of work, in that it's a project from this sort of critical early time period in his career that's actually still owned by the original the original clients of his, and they still love it all these years later, and graciously allowed us to sort of spend a whole afternoon there in their wonderful home. And then the sort of crowning achievement of this portion body of Johnson's work, obviously, was the mushroom house. And this was sort of the most complicated and inventive use of the earth form concrete. And we're back to making sort of a unitized building where you have earthen forms that you're casting concrete into and then assembling a building out of them. But in this case, each pod is supported on a sort of separate column, and then the pods themselves are made out of two different castings that are melded together in midair while the pieces are sort of craned into place. So it probably should come as no surprise that one of the more alarming things that is caught on some of Johnson's construction video is that due to the inability for the crane provider to provide a properly sized crane as specified by Johnson, they had a smaller crane on site craning these castings into place, and the crane actually began to tip into the ravine and had to let loose the casting. The casting sort of crashed to the earth below. But luckily the Antels and Johnson were not deterred and persevered and completed the house. And then in 2001, Johnson designed an addition that is more in the vein of the airplane house in Penfield Presbyterian, that was a sort of earthwork casting as an addition to the more famous original counterpart. So in these photos, you can see the two different earthen molds, and then sort of the concrete's cast into those, and then sort of assembled onto the columns of the pod. You can see in the background on the right photo, one of the base sort of pans castings has been lifted and set into place. And on the photo here on the left, you can see they're craning in one of the roof sections, and then there's the temporary wood structure in the center is essentially for temporary support while the two pieces are melded together. You can see there's what appear like these sort of sticks sticking out of the bottom of each one of the columns of the pod roof, and that's steel rebar. And essentially, the rebar is stitched together between the two portions, and then concrete hand packed around that to cover up the joints that we're seeing in the photo on the right to create the completed space. This is the original living room pod as designed. It was the only pod that was completed as was originally intended with the castings. So one of the efforts that they made to make it easier for the smaller crane to set these in place was to eliminate this sort of decorative central column and buttresses that sprawl out from the center here, that's seen in the photograph. So this design element is more in keeping with Johnson's original design inspiration, and that was to base the design of the building off of the Queen Anne's lace flower, so not mushrooms. The mushroom house was a name that this house acquired very early on, but it was not original inspiration for Johnson and the design of the space. And there it is complete. And so this next section, so Johnson continued to be interested in pursuing designs of sculptural organic design, as we call it. So Johnson designed in both sort of realms of organic design. So we have the sculptural that derives forms from nature, but also often has complex curvilinear geometry. And then the other sort of facet of organic design is more of an abstraction of natural forms and playing off of the inherent base geometries of those and creating sort of more faceted forms. And we'll see both examples throughout his career. So this section is on sort of the sculptural organic designs that were not earth formed concrete like we saw in the first portion here. So this is one of the more notable residential designs under that umbrella. This is also a protected landmark in the town of Brighton, the Norrie House. I like to sort of think of it as if you turn Temple Sinai into a house, they were built almost concurrently, and they both feature these sort of prominent skylights and swooping roof lines that curve upwards towards and terminate at the skylight. And you can see that sort of dramatic effect that's lent to that. And even a number of his residential designs, he continued to collaborate with his artist friends. And we can see in here, there's some remnants of the Sechrist brothers and their use of doing some earth casting just as decorative elements. We have this sort of standing panel in the left photo there at the entrance to the house. And then there was a room divider that was repurposed by the current owners as the front of the island, which is visible in the middle photograph. That's another view here. So in this design in particular is rather interesting that you can see some last vestiges of Johnson's interest in Japanese architecture, Japanese sort of courtyard house design with the sort of initial low single-story broad overhang eaves, and then this clean white stucco and dark, almost black trim, but then that's crowned by this sort of very Johnson-esque dramatic roof form over the top. But you can sort of see the tinges of where we begin to leave that orthogonal geometry behind. The Schwartz house, this is a house that in particular was a favorite of Jean France, very esteemed local architectural historian. She preferred the Schwartz house over the Mushroom house. And this is a sort of very dramatic design that, while simple in plan, essentially if you were to picture the letter J, it's roughly a J in shape if you were to look at it from the sky. And then as the roof runs along the J, heading towards that, the sort of the bottom of the J, the roof increases in height incrementally and becomes the sort of billowing, spiraling sail, and creating this almost 30-foot tall living room space facing out towards the wooded backyard that this house is situated within. There it is today. And you can start to get a little bit of a sense here. If you look over the garage, which is at the sort of top of the J, you can see that the roof is essentially a simple shed roof and has not a very steep slope, but then as it goes along, the ridge of the roof continues to rise, creating that sort of spiraling effect. And this is, like Katie mentioned, this is sort of Johnson's method of the quote unquote warped roof. So each structural member is straight, but by incrementally changing the angle of each subsequent roofing member, and then as you tie in between those pieces of the structure with the roofing itself, and especially using materials like shingles, they begin to soften. They begin to soften those facets into creating a smooth curve and creating these sort of complex forms with more rigid, straight materials. This is an odd, almost a sort of odd anomaly during this time period. The Hopeful Ski Chalet overlooks the Hunt Hollow ski resort. I would say this is maybe the most mushroom-like of his houses. This is really the mushroom house per se. But it's a curious design that it does appear to be that sort of rough formed concrete, but in fact, it's actually sculpted spray foam. And you have this sort of almost whalebone jaw opening with this dramatic porch facing out over the ski hill. And then these porthole windows you can sort of see marching along the side on the right that are sort of sculpted into the exterior of the home. The only religious building that he designed and had built outside of the Rochester area is St. John the Baptist Church. This is made out of concrete, but it's cast in the conventional way, using metal and wood forms that are built on site upward and then poured into. And then when the forms are removed, the walls are left standing. So we're not tipping anything up. We're not sculpting anything in the earth. But there's probably some pretty complex work to make the forms to cast into. And the building is roughly in the shape of a dove from above, and then incorporates the same sort of warped roof technique to create this dramatic doubly curved surface of a roof overhead. And inside, that's sort of clad in this beautiful mahogany that curves ever upward towards the center of the church, where there's a continuous skylight leading from above the altar all the way down to the back wall, where rather curiously, again, he continued to work with a lot of his favorite artist collaborators, who worked with Carl Zolo again, and co-designed the Stations of the Cross for the church, which are actually outside in the garden space, sort of out of frame to the right. You can see the whole back wall of the church is glass, and it faces out to a garden where the Stations of the Cross are actually freestanding sculptures. This is a historic photo of the altar showing the original altar screen, which was was designed and fabricated by the Sechrist brothers, and it was an assemblage of steel and glass discs. And then the altar furniture, both the wood and the carved stone altar, were actually designed by a local Buffalo-based artist. And to our knowledge, this was the only time that Johnson collaborated with that artist in particular. Unfortunately, the altar screen has been removed, as has all of the altar furniture, with the exception of the altar itself. Phyllis Wheatley Library in Rochester. This is nearing the sort of the tail end of Johnson's sort of public career. After the mid 1970s, he almost exclusively only designed single family homes and some sort of multifamily housing, but was not doing sort of publicly commissioned projects like churches or publicly funded buildings like libraries. This design in particular pays homage to one of Johnson's other mentors, although not necessarily a mentor in person, but an architect that he looked up to, the French modernist Corbusier. And specifically, Corbusier is building the Chapel Ronchamp in France that has this distinctive sort of thick cloud-like roof that gently slopes over top of the building, which Johnson is doing here. But then is sort of inserting this continuous glass wall that lights the reading rooms of the space, and then is bookended by these two more solid masses, the larger on the right being the auditorium space, and then the smaller on the left being the administrative offices for the library. he continued to collaborate with his artist friends on this building as well and continued to use concrete. But again, this is not earth cast concrete, but employed, which you can sort of see here in the construction. They made forms utilize with plywood linings that they pre-melted with hot pickaxes and sort of round pieces of bar to create this very curious and complex sort of circular motif that carries throughout the concrete, which you can see here a little closer up on the interior. And then below the sort of billowing roof, there was this sort of matrix of hung fabric squares that served for sound deadening. Unfortunately, in more modern times, the sort of the acoustic attenuation that we see here has been removed, and a sort of standard drop ceiling has been put in its place. But with the exception of the ceiling, the large majority of the library still remains as Johnson designed it. St. Christopher's Church in Child, this sort of bridges the gap between the sort of sculptural and more faceted organic design realms of Johnson's career. And this building, like a number of his religious buildings, sort of heavily draws on sort of representative metaphor in the building form. So the parable of St. Christopher talks about him sort of carrying the cross, the Christ child across, excuse me, across the rough and choppy waters of a river, and as the child continues to get heavier and heavier as he continues to cross. So it's not too much of a stretch of imagination to see that in the form of the building here, where we have a sort of abstracted human-like figure carrying a heavy burden, in this case, just carrying the sort of cross pinnacle of the building, and surrounding that figure are these sort of faceted, spiraling wave-like forms that are cascading up and around the figure. And on the inside, it creates the sort of dramatic effect. As the roof continues to spiral up, it spirals up around the skylight that lights the altar space, which also, like many of the churches, has Wendell Castle design altar furniture. And the interior is clad in the cedar shingles, which originally would have carried outside onto this curving roof, which is now clad in asphalt shingles. And then the faceted wave forms sort of ascend in height towards the altar. It's a little clearer here in that photograph, looking sort of across the church. And then in the mid-1970s, Jim designed the second house for his family. So his business had continued to grow, as did his family, and the desire to have sort of more space to roam for the family, as well as establishing his office in a sort of purpose-built environment. Led to selling their first house and then designing and building this new house, which has this sort of wonderfully doubly curved roof clad in the cedar shingles. And it has this quaint, almost, it feels like a sort of a house you might see in Hobbiton. I've always thought it was sort of whimsical and almost like it came out of a fairy tale, but it's playing a lot of the sort of same themes, where we have this warped roof form, very sculptural roof that lends a lot of the character to the building. And in this case, it has a very rather private front that then opens up towards the back, which you can see in the bottom left photo, where we have the sort of walls of glass and large windowed dormers of the bedrooms on the second floor looking out over the backyard, which is sort of not even hinted at from the front. The tile surround seen at the fireplace in the top right was designed by Marg Antel. So Marg Antel was the client for the Mushroom House. So she was a very talented ceramicist who worked with Jim frequently. There were a number of the houses that we found throughout our project that incorporated Marg Antel tile work into them. And this is the sort of second group of the organic design umbrella, the geometric or more faceted designs. This is a house on Brighton. This is not a designated landmark in the town of Brighton. Maybe they will go ahead and designate this one as well, and then they'll have all three major Johnson works in their town designated. But this is a interesting sort of faceted design. Almost feels a little bit more like a sort of modern sort of shed design house. Perhaps the most whimsical part of the design for me is I always loved sort of the effect of implying that there was a drawbridge at the front doors. You can see the heavy chains that are sort of playfully supporting the sort of the platform and stoop at the front doors. And Temple Beth Am, this is the smallest sanctuary space that he designed. It has a very touching story about it. I think speaks volumes about Jim as not just an architect, but as a sort of very caring individual, not just for the members of his family, but the congregation of Beth Am was a sort of a new burgeoning congregation similar to Temple Sinai. And they had built a small, modest sanctuary on their site here in Henrietta in the early to mid 1960s. And in a string of sort of violent crimes that were perpetuated by the local Rochester Mafia at the time, used oddly as a diversion tactic, not necessarily as a sort of direct hate crime, but the sort of string of crimes that they did included bombing the sanctuary space that was present on the site. And Jim reached out to the congregation and offered to provide them a design for a new sanctuary to oversee its construction free of charge, and sort of came up with this interesting sort of faceted cloaked figure that in my mind, sort of, if one were to try to interpret this building, thinking about some of the metaphors that Johnson drew on in previous designs, there's this sort of what's called a tree of life window at the center that lights the sanctuary, and then this sort of broad overhanging cloaked roof that to me feels like it's embracing the building as in a way to sort of make it feel like it has a sort of sense of safety and a sense of shelter for the congregation. And then his last ecclesiastic design was for the Memorial AME Zion Church. And this is actually right across the road from Phyllis Wheatley Library in the city. So it's a great opportunity to sort of see two public works by Johnson side by side. The AME Zion congregation is the oldest African-American congregation in Rochester, New York. And this is the fourth building that the congregation has had built for them. And this was prompted out of a urban renewal effort that was to demolish the building they had been occupying. At the very last minute, their building was saved and is still standing today. But it was sort of a tenuous enough situation that the congregation made the decision to move and to build a new sort of fourth church for themselves, and then worked with Jim Johnson to design it and create this oddly sort of faceted form that has this peaked pyramidal form over the sanctuary and then a long, low wing extending outward from it for their administrative offices, a social hall, and other functions. And then the interior sort of a signature dramatic thrust skyward with skylight over top of the altar space in the sanctuary. And again, more Wendell Castle altar furniture there. And at the back wall of the church, the memorial windows from their previous building, which memorialized significant members of their congregation, including Frederick Douglass, who started his North Star newspaper in the basement of AME Zion Church, as well as Susan B. Anthony, were sort of memorializing the windows of their third building, and those windows were saved and incorporated into the new design for the church, which when you enter the building, they're the first thing you see before you enter into the sanctuary itself. In the main vestibule of the building, you're confronted with these windows, which are sort of lit from behind by the lights of the sanctuary. And the Cates House. So this is a very dramatic sighting. Again, a sort of dramatically faceted form, and it's a sort of three and a half story tall building that's up on these stilts overlooking the Irondequoit Creek Gorge. And this topmost, you can sort of see in both of these photos, the glass at the very top is this almost treehouse-like effect. It's a small reading space that looks over the living room, which if you look in the right photo, you can see that the glass continues downward. That's steeply sloped, what looks like a roof, and that's lighting this tall sort of two-story space above the main living room that lights up into the bedrooms and other areas of the house. You can see a little glimpse there of the interior from this historic photograph, that sloped glass wall continuing upward, and then a little bit of the ceiling of the first floor just on the top left of the photograph. So as mentioned before, Jim had done a number of multifamily housing projects. A lot of them are more interesting than your standard, but are not as inventive as his single family homes or his churches, just by virtue of their need to be more efficient. But one of the most unique sort of accomplishments of his career was a multifamily housing complex that was built in Fairport, the Fairport Apartments. This was a business venture that he established with himself and then one of his longtime early employees, Thomas Hamilton. And he and Tom Hamilton sort of established housing systems as a new business to pursue the need for making sort of modular, affordable housing. And sort of they tried, unfortunately in vain, to pursue various sort of federal projects throughout the country and beyond, but developed this very elaborate system of essentially casting an entire living unit in concrete all at once. And we'll see here in some of the process photos. They did a proof of concept initially, which is seen here in the photograph. So it was made out of sort of 3 of their cast units, and we can see them if you sort of pay attention to the slightly projected window overhangs that have these odd sort of trapezoidal shape. You can see that form repeating in sort of 2 or 3 different spots, but they were sort of stacked upon one another to create the sort of proof of concept that also served as the office for the business, and for a time also served as the office for Johnson's architectural firm. That unfortunately is what it looks like today on the top right. So it's been so completely obscured that the sort of striking modernism of this example building has been completely sort of lost to time. But in these photographs from an advertisement for housing systems, begin to sort of see the very elaborate process through which they went to build these. They made a sort of movable factory on site, and then had a very elaborate steel casting system where they were able to put all the reinforcing, the electrical, plumbing, all other components that you would need for a functioning housing unit inside this elaborate casting. You pour the concrete into that casting, as seen in the bottom middle photo. And then when the casting is done, it's pulled out by a sort of piece of machinery of their own making, which is essentially a gantry crane attached to 2 very large sort of tractors that are able to drive this massively heavy piece of concrete and then set it down on a foundation. There's another photo there of the sort of gantry crane apparatus lifting one of the castings into place, and then several of the castings already set on the site and onto their foundations. Unfortunately, just like the example building, the Fairport Apartments have been largely obscured to time due to a very sort of invasive renovation that was done maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. This is Brook Hill Village in the town of Penfield. This is one of the more typical multifamily housing projects of Johnson's. These are built in a more typical manner using wood, just wood frame construction, but still, like we've seen some of his other designs of this era, this sculptural form of the roof plays a sort of major role in the design of the building. This is obviously nowhere near as complex as some of the houses, but it's still sort of more distinctive than your average run-of-the-mill design. Another one in that same sort of vein is the Bay Village condos. These were built with concrete block and then have this interesting site design, in that each unit sort of steps back from the other, cascading down the hill so that each unit has an uninterrupted view to the bay. And then because of the steep slope of the site, there are sort of 2 layers of these stepped buildings. It allowed Johnson to sort of sneak a parking garage in between the 2 because of the height change, without sort of having that obscure views and access to that sort of housing buildings on either side. These are some drawings from the early stages of the Bay Village project. It was to be a much more elaborate design. And then these are some examples of some other multifamily housing projects throughout the region that Johnson designed. He did do the first phase of Bristol Harbor, just seen in the bottom right rendering. And then a really curious design project of his for multifamily housing was a series of dormitory buildings that he designed for migrant housing for the Curtis Burns company. for migrants coming in for the sort of annual apple harvest in the Rochester region. So there are 3 complexes of these. There's the low single-story flat roof buildings, and all 3 still exist today. I'm just going to quickly breeze through the unbuilt work, but just the biggest takeaway I would say for this is that to note that his unbridled creativity continued not only all the way throughout his career, which we'll see in some of his later buildings, but also in buildings that were never built. This is the first, his project number 1, he actually stamped it. And we found a photograph in his archives that showed a scale model he made of the Our Lady of Mercy parish in Greece. This he had hoped would be their church sanctuary, would have been the 4th building on the site, but was never constructed. This is an attempt that he made to advocate for renovating our sort of beloved but now lost Claude Bragdon train station. It sort of very much upset him to sort of see a project of such renown from a predecessor of his be demolished, and sort of in his own way tried to show what a potential new future could be for the building in an attempt to save it, but alas, it was not successful. This is an unbuilt house in Pittsburgh with a rather unique and interesting roof shape. This would have been another earthen-formed concrete design, but was never built. Katie and I call this the sort of onion house, but he creates this sort of dome that fades down into part of the sort of earthwork. And so the earthwork is only partially dug out, and then the house fit within it, which is rather interesting. Another design sketch. This was a design that he did in the 90s for Performing Arts Center in the shape of a massive violin, which I find very entertaining. And then, so here's he did have a number of repeat clients throughout his career that he did multiple designs for and returned to again and again. One of them was the Altier family and the Altier brothers that ran the Altier shoe stores. Jim designed over a dozen stores for the Altiers family. Unfortunately, did not find a lot of photo documentation of the stores. He did have this one great black and white photograph, which you see here, of one of the store interiors, which he co-designed with his common artist collaborator, Carl Zolo, the metalworker. And then another photo that we did find at some later point was, this is an Altiers that was in the suburbs of Syracuse and Camillus that he also designed for them. And then he designed a series of additions for the Altiers brothers. And then for Dick Altier, he designed a whole sort of brand new home for him. This was the only sort of full new build house that he did for the Altiers brothers, but it has this very sort of distinctive design, faceted form, which again initially appears like it's maybe only a single story with this overhanging roof. But inside it opens up, and this is sort of a distinctive design feature of a lot of his late 1970s and 80s work that we noticed, is they became very fascinated with creating these sectionally complex buildings where there might be 5 or even 6 floor levels within the building, and each floor level essentially distinguishing a different programmatic function within the house. You can see another view of that house. It's cascading down here to the grand sort of living family room at the lowest level, the kitchen and dining room at a level up from there, and then the sort of mezzanine level above that where you enter, and then a bedroom level higher up above that. For James Bailey, Jim did 3 very distinctive home designs for, as well as a number of projects on his factory. James Bailey was the co-owner of the the Hardwood House furniture business, which some of you may be familiar with. It's no longer around, but was a very popular sort of business in the 70s and 80s. This is the first house he designed for James Bailey around 1970. Strikingly modern, but certainly a little more staid for a Johnson design, but still features sort of materials that he commonly liked to use. The sort of block-like granite that you see forming the fireplace, you may have noticed that material being used on a number of buildings we showed you previously, like the Norrie House and a few others. That was a common material that seemed to be a favorite of Johnson's around the sort of late 60s and early 70s for some of his residential designs. The second house he designed for James Bailey is this odd sort of assemblage of different sized pyramids arranged around one another in slightly intersecting portions. And then the third and final that he designed in California, which is this sort of stupendously beautiful design perched on a sort of rocky cliffside overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And then the interior of that, again, similar to what we saw with the Altier house, where you have these sort of cascading levels of floors for different functions within the house that spiral around the sort of central pillar or sort of, skylit pillar in the middle. Unfortunately, of the 3 Bailey houses that Jim designed and built, this one was lost to a wildfire in 2008. And here's just some of the later work, just to give you a sense of he continued to be massively creative throughout his career. The house on the top left was part of the Architecture 83 project out in Mendon, which is this wonderful street where every single house was designed by a leading architect in Rochester in the early 1980s. The house on the bottom right is another sort of mid-1980s design of Johnson's, this very interesting deconstructivist almost design with these different flat planes pierced by sort of square and rectangular openings. And the house on the bottom left, he designed for one of the daughters of the family that commissioned him for the airplane house in Victor. And that house was completed in 2002. And then these, there's a couple more houses here. These are all from the late 80s and early 90s. The house on the left, a series of photos there, is in Macedon and was built in the mid to late 1980s. Probably the most elaborate and expensive of Johnson's designs of his entire career. It was a very large, very expansive home. The house on the top right was a family retreat outside of Sodus overlooking Lake Ontario, and has this sort of faceted triangular form in the shape of the Star of David. And then the house at the bottom right is another one of these sort of cascading floor designs, the Checkman residence. And then some very late ones, a house in Massachusetts on the left from the late 1990s, and then the house that he co-designed with his daughter, Betsy, that was completed in 2011. And so we always like to sort of end with this quote. This is a picture of Jim working on the addition to the Mushroom House in 2001, carving into the sort of earthwork before it's cast with concrete. But it's sort of quote by Jim: "I've always enjoyed the ability to seek a new way of doing things. I've never really stuck to a style. I generally try to make every building stand on its own 2 feet, be in itself its own creation." I think that embodies pretty well the amazing creativity of Johnson in his career. So with that, we'll take some questions. And while we're taking questions, I'm going to run one of those construction videos.
I saw there was already a question in the chat about Johnson's archives, so we can address that. Some of his drawings have gone to the University of Rochester, but most of them are still in his final office in Pittsford. And so we were going through the drawings just as he had left them, which he kept everything, and the order in which things were saved and kept was idiosyncratic, but we kind of dug our way through. So we're hoping that eventually more of that material is going to go to the University of Rochester, but it is a challenge because there's just so much of it. He kept out every draft drawing, every little sketch, everything. So it's a lot of material, but hopefully that can all be saved because it's an amazing amount of stuff. And then, as you've seen, there's the video that you're seeing now of Temple Sinai. There's slides that he took. It was pretty incredible. Somebody's asking about the street in Mendon. I think it's called Partridge Hill.
Yes.
At the Architecture 80.
Correct.
283.
Yeah, something that I always try to tell everyone to sort of keep on their radar in the future, or in our profession, when something sort of becomes historic, when it crosses the sort of 50-year mark, that I strongly suspect that'll be sort of one of the sort of treasured areas of sort of distinctive 1980s architecture in Rochester when the time comes. But it's certainly an amazing street where every house was designed by a leading architect of the time.
We have another question. Will there be a recording? Yes, Brandon is recording it. So get in touch with him at the library. Is there a comprehensive list of his work? So that was what we were doing as part of our project, was doing the best we could to come up with a comprehensive list. And it was an interesting process because he kept a project list, but it was incomplete, and he repeated numbers and skipped numbers. And so it was very interesting to try to put that all together. So as part of our survey project, we did the best we could to come up with a list, which we organized in a few different ways. So we did by number, by location, by building type. And we should get a copy of that to the library. Actually, Gina is working on putting out a kind of more user-friendly version. The one we did was kind of technical and oriented to National Register criteria. But yes, there is a list that we've been working on. And at this point, I think Chris should talk about the video and the anecdote we have about this building.
Oh, yeah. So let me get it back here so we can look at it again while I'm talking. So you can see in the video here, sort of Jim's panning over, their cameraman's panning over. You can see a number of the panels sitting in the earth. They've been cast, but they haven't been lifted out yet. And then a few have been lifted up into place. And then the sort of temporary scaffolding that's erected in between them is just there so that they can set those sort of steel beams that hold the panels apart. And it was a relatively simple system, and that those little steel beams, it's essentially a sort of slip and pinned connection. So at each end here, there'd be a little pin that sort of slips in and that holds the steel in place. And then down below, the big heavy bottoms of those panels that we were seeing, they sort of lock into and are tied to the foundation so that it doesn't move. But near the sort of end of erecting the sort of final pair of panels, as Katie sort of mentioned, and we sort of mentioned in some of the commentaries, that Jim always liked to be very involved with his project and very hands-on, sort of beyond what a normal architect would do. Certainly that can be attributed to some of his upbringing, but then he continued that sort of throughout his career with a lot of his buildings, especially any of the earth cast concrete ones. So in a lot of these, he was physically on the job site and a number of cases physically working the concrete. And for Temple Sinai, he wanted to be part of the process of setting one of those steel beams and setting the pin for the beam. And so they had erected one of the two panels and they were bringing the next one in, and Jim climbed up on the scaffolding and was giving directions to the crane operators to bring the paneling closer and closer, and then got it near where it needed to be, and was about ready to sort of set the pin, but the panel moved a little bit with its sort of crane attachment, and it pinned his hand in between the steel beam and the concrete panel, and the panel moved enough that it was starting to disturb the scaffolding in between. So not only was he sort of in pain with having his hand pinned between this massive piece of concrete, was potentially sort of beginning to tip the scaffolding over. So he waved sort of frantically to get the crane operator to pull back, and they did. But then he had to sort of get rushed to the hospital to get his hand stitched up from the sort of wound that had developed from being pinned at this massive piece of concrete. But Jim, always wanting to be ever vigilant on his jobs, refused to sort of take time off or to go home after getting his stitches, and went back to the construction site after receiving his stitches. Okay. Do we have any others?
That's all I've seen. If anyone else has any questions, and actually I have a question for whether sometimes we have people who live in or have lived in Johnson houses, and sometimes we have Johnson family members. So if there's anybody with your own knowledge of Jim and his family that you'd like to share, or lives in or lived in one of his houses, please let us know in the chat. And in the meantime, we'll show one more video here. Oh, someone asked if any buildings have had structural or water issues due to their experimental nature. Yes. And the most extreme example being Penfield Presbyterian that Chris talked about, where the water damage was such that the congregation kind of threw up their hands and got somebody else to design that encasing superstructure around it.
And I do know AME Zion Church had to have some corrective structural work done to provide some additional lateral support where that sort of pyramidal thrust upward
Mhm.
in the sanctuary was at. But I think Penfield Presbyterian in particular was the only really major one.
Yeah, it is common with kind of these newer buildings that have maybe roof lines that don't take Rochester winters into account and things like that. Do sometimes have problems. Oh, so here's someone who took music lessons from Mrs. Johnson in the house. That's very cool.
I believe this photo will show the crane beginning to tip into the wooded ravine, if I remember this clip correctly. But you can see, yeah, a lot of these you can see the great close-up where you see the rebar coming out of what are these structural columns at each corner of the pod, and that rebar sort of slips past the rebar in the same location at the sort of floor portion of the casting, and they're tied together and then concrete filled in around them to sort of essentially create this sort of highly stable sort of cage of structure. So it's precarious when they're assembling it, but especially with the mushroom house, once it's assembled, there we go.
There it goes.
There's the drop. Once it was assembled, by its nature, it's a very sort of structurally sound building, and it's just more so the problem of getting it assembled. All right.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't see anything else in the chat, so.
Well, everyone, thank you so much to Chris and Katie for this amazing presentation. I've long marveled at some of Johnson's work myself, but learning more about the man and about his work is just fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us. We will see you again in January. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.